Welcome back to the Cream City Club podcast. I am Spencer Michaelis, and I'm here again with Gunnar Amelung. Jack Stern's voice is going to be heard throughout this as well. We recorded this last week, and we ended up going so long that we decided we need to record, or we need to split this into two different sessions. So this is the mailbag portion of last week's podcast, which we discussed Rhys Hoskins, and then a few minor updates on some other news and information around the league. If you're listening and you haven't yet subscribed, please take a moment to do so on whatever platform you're on. Follow us on Twitter at the Cream City Pod to stay up to date on these episode releases. Be sure to participate in the giveaway that is currently happening on our page. Well, it's currently happening at the time of this recording. I don't know if it'll be done or not by the time we get to this release. But like I said, this episode is going to be focused on all of the great questions that we got from you guys regarding all things Brewers. And we will dive into that right now.
New section here. We're going to call it a mailbag, which is just our Twitter questions kind of compiled here. So we're just going to go through all of these and try to answer them as best as we can. So first, I'll kind of tie in one and a half of these together, we'll say. So Cole Cloudy Husky 18 asked, what are some realistic trade targets for the Brewers this offseason? I'm starved for a Brewers hot stove content. You did get a little bit of that, I should say. And then maybe we can tie that into Caleb Go's first question of who's kind of a realistic trade target that you guys have. So I think first I'll just go here. I'll just throw out my one tidbit and I'll let you guys go. I think before we got Rhys, I was kind of wondering if, to a little bit of a lesser extent, I was kind of thinking about maybe we can get like a 2018 Yelich type trade going a little bit, maybe a guy where we can kind of take some of those young scraps that a little disrespectful with the scraps, but like the Garrett Mitchells of the world, like, and maybe try to get a guy where we could have him at first base with some power, but that role obviously got filled. So, you guys probably have better names than I do specifically. So do you guys have any trades that you like, that you kind of been thinking about?
For a little bit, I was thinking the Rangers might be a decent trade partner for Corbin Burns. They need some help in that starting rotation, and they have a little bit of depth on the position player side. I know Ezekiel Duran is a guy who has really big power, but is kind of without a position right now. He can play shortstop, third base, so could help the Brewers still if they want to make that kind of move. I'm not entirely sure what the asking price is on Duran. The Rangers have publicly said that it's sky high, but I'm not entirely sure that's the case because I don't think he has that much value where they could ask the world for him. But he was a highly regarded prospect, hits for a ton of power, and could fill a need at third base. Or even if you are talking about, Willy Adames not being here long term, you could try to see what Duran could do at shortstop too. I think that's actually where he's graded out the best defensively in his young big league career after moving around through all kinds of different positions. So that could have been an option. I would have liked Colby Miller in a Burns trade from Baltimore, but I don't think that Baltimore is at all trying to trade any of their absolute top prospects. So I think that Duran was one I was thinking of. Maybe one of the younger starters from Seattle if they would have liked one of the Brewers' young outfielders. But other than that, those are really the main ones that I was thinking of.
Yeah, you stole two of the ones that I was talking about there, but Kobe Mayo, I think is who you meant, but
Yes, I knew I misspoke and then it was too late to take it back. So,
no, he's definitely been the guy that in a Burns deal has been one of the, like, if I'm looking for the most ideal return, he's always felt like it would probably be right up there. And then the Mariner starters is one I just have kept coming back to. I don't know. It's hard to say in baseball, especially what kind of value a Garrett Mitchell or somebody like that will hold. But if they are interested in moving one of their young pitchers for a young outfielder or a young bat like a Mitchell or even a Frelick or Weimer, I would be pretty interested in that type of scenario. I think that someone like Brian Wu might be. I'll put this: George Kirby is not going to be on the table. He's not going to be available. I don't think that Gilbert would be available either, but Emerson Hancock and Brian Wu seem like they could be in the right deal. I could see Bryce Miller also being on the table in the right deal. I just don't know how, like all of us, nobody knows how that trio of outfielders would be valued by certain teams around the league. As we found out last year, the Oakland A's valued Esteury Ruiz as a superstar prospect, basically. They were wrong. And pretty much everybody else in baseball would have told him that. But you never know what the Mariners might see in one of those three where they would say, yeah, we like that value. And if the Brewers could make it happen, any of those three that I named that would be possible would be really, really nice additions to the future starting staff. The one that's kind of going to be the next era after we lose Burns. We've lost Woodruff. Freddie's kind of running short on his contract coming up in the next couple of years here. You kind of need that next wave, and I do think that any of those three would be a really nice addition. So I guess dream target is probably one of those guys because I don't see a vet really being on the table too much. I think it would probably be a younger type of player that the Brewers are trying to that they could use now and also in this next wave that they're planning for right now.
And then Garrett, or not Garrett's, Caleb Gopak goes second question. Where I'm just gonna read it as you wrote it. I'm not sure I fully understand your question here, and maybe Spencer or something can help me with the understanding of this. But he said infield question mark or comma. Do you think a trade is made before or during the season? Potentially one of our outfielders also. So
Yeah.
I'm guessing maybe with one of our infielders, is there a trade there? Or Spencer, I think you said you
I
kind of
was
understood
taking it
this.
as possibly moving one of the outfielders to gain an infielder. That's how I was understanding it. Um, like I said, I think of that trio, if something is on the table that makes sense, somebody that they believe could potentially be Adamas's replacement if they don't plan to, or if they're unable to extend him, um, I could see that type of deal being made. I'd be more surprised if they add to the infield by trade if it's not like a Burns trade where you're getting a really, really big prospect that you expect to help right away. But if they get somebody I mean, second base is a tough position to trade for. It would probably be a shortstop that you move to second base while Willie's there or something. I don't have any names for that, but a Duran is like, I don't see the Rangers trading for an outfielder, but a Duran type of player could make some sense in that type of swap too. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I think a trade for pitching or for high level prospects is probably more likely than a trade for an infielder of any kind, just because there is a lot of upper level, other than shortstop, upper level talent at these positions in the minor leagues right now. And I think the Brewers like a lot of them. So um, shortstop is that one that if they found a deal, sure, maybe I could see that happening, but I don't have any names for you, and I'm not exactly sure who we'd be looking at in that type of scenario.
I don't think we have a question like this, so I'll just toss it to you guys because it kind of mixes in with this a little bit. Um, how likely do you think a trade is, even in general, right now? Do you expect the Brewers to even make a trade at this point? Do you think we're kind of stand pat? Because our roster is with Reese now, it does feel a little bit more sturdy, and you can kind of make it work a little bit more, I'd say. So, do you guys think a trade's even going to happen at this point, or no?
I mean, minor trade maybe like around the edges of the roster, like, trading for like a Taylor Clark or something like they did earlier this offseason. But if you're talking about major trades or trading any of their young outfielders, no, I don't really expect that to happen. Again, we've talked about they have a lot of flexibility with these guys, a lot of depth, and really just the fact that so many of these guys have minor league options and are not necessarily fully polished yet, especially guys like Joey Weimer, put Garrett Mitchell in that camp too. Possibly even Sal Frelick if there really just is no power there. But I think Frelick's more likely to stick on the roster than some of those other guys. But you can send those guys down to AAA. There is no pressure to put them on the big league roster, no pressure to trade them. You can keep them in the organization. So I don't think the Brewers are especially motivated to make any big trades right now. Maybe something does happen where, like Spencer was talking about, they do find an infielder who they think can really help them up the middle long term. But I think that's really what it would take. It would have to be more so the product of another team is really willing to give the Brewers, some kind of young, controllable talent that they value very highly. I don't think it's going to be motivated by, any desire by the Brewers to unload some guys or ease any roster log jams, because I don't think they really have any log jams. They're in the driver's seat as far as any kinds of trade negotiations go.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we saw even back to 2018 when everybody expected the Brewers to move one of those outfielders. In the end, they moved Brett Phillips at the trade deadline, but it took till then. And Domingo played out that whole season. everybody thought there were so many Chris Archer for Domingo Santana type rumors at that time. I think that they value this type of depth, and they would kind of like to see which one of them is going to hit before making the move. And they're willing to probably sacrifice a little bit of the potential return by saying, all right, if one of them flakes out, obviously we're not getting much for him at that point. Whereas right now you might have a little bit more value, but they also don't want to be the team that moves a guy, picks the wrong one of the three to move, and he's the one who hits and the other two aren't good. That's a worse spot to be in, I think, than having less value for one of the guys who doesn't work out. So yeah, I would be a little surprised, like Jack said, a minor league deal of some sorts, kind of like the Albert Dunn trade or something, the Taylor Clark, the Bryce Wilson trade from last year, where it's like a cash for an interesting arm. They're going to be making those throughout the year. They always do. But a big trade definitely feels less likely now than I would have thought, probably like heading into the winter meetings, where I thought that might be more on the table.
So moving on to our next question that we got from Tanner DeGrave. He said, percent chance Burns is going to be moved, and if not, both of your opinions on the idea that they may wait until the deadline to offload on a buyer, while hoping nothing catastrophic happens on the injury front. I assume he kind of means to that starting rotation a little bit there, because we are kind of running slightly thin in the starting rotation if he were to be moved. So, yeah, I guess one of you guys can take it away here.
He's not getting moved. I think that it seems a lot clearer at this point. At the start of the offseason, I thought it was about a slam dunk to trade him, and I still think they should, even after signing Hoskins, but I don't think he's getting moved. The Brewers never seemed especially motivated to move him, and I do kind of wonder if part of this is due to his trade market really not shaping up to be quite as robust as the Brewers might have been hoping, and that's something we can, talk a little bit more about, but I don't think he's going anywhere. I don't think they're hoping that they'll be in a spot where they move him at the deadline. That, like Spencer had said earlier, is only going to happen, if for some reason they fall out of contention at the deadline, then it makes a lot of sense to move him. As far as the injury part of that question, I think he might be talking about an injury to Burns, because, if he gets hurt, his trade value basically doesn't exist anymore. He could be talking about the rest of the rotation too, though, just in terms of, you need a guy at the top, and Burns has been very durable. And if you lose that, that's a lot of innings you have to replace off the bat, let alone if you have some other guys in that rotation get hurt. But I don't think it's happening. I think that the moving him at the deadline thing is what they'll do if everything goes wrong for the rest of the team this year. But I think their plan right now is ride it out with him through the entirety of his club control, and then just get that draft picked when he signs somewhere else.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. We have a question about the draft pick coming up in a little bit too, about how all of that might be handled. But I agree. I think, like I said earlier, they're going to have to fall out of contention for him to be on the block at this point. I do think the injury is something that I'm sure the Brewers have factored in, and I will say, knock on wood, Corbin's been the healthiest by far of the starters that we've had coming through, especially of the main group. There is always going to be that risk, and you would risk potentially getting nothing for him if it totally falls apart, where if it's a bad injury, like Woodruff ended up having, where nobody's going to give him a long-term deal, you're not going to be able to trade him at the deadline, and that qualifying offer he might actually accept, or you don't give it to him because of an injury. That would suck. That's worst case scenario. I'm sure that's weighed in slightly by the Brewers, but if they're planning for the worst all the time, that's probably not the right way to look at things. Yeah, we'll touch more on the draft pick part of it too, but I do think that's also being weighed in pretty heavily here. The fact that if they do play it out, they're probably going to get a pretty nice draft pick out of it because of the qualifying offer. So, like I said, we'll touch on that later, but all of that is weighing in. And the more I think about it, the more I start to understand a little bit more why they're willing to do this. But I'm still with you, Jack. I think the best case scenario was and still is trading him for a good haul, but they might not be getting offered that. So who knows? It's hard to say. We don't know what the offers are that are on the table or have been on the table, and maybe they just don't view it as even being worth much more than that draft pick that they're going to get in the future. So yeah, percent chance he's getting moved before the deadline, I would say less than 1. And then at the deadline, it's going to take a pretty big collapse, I think, from the Brewers in terms of what I would expect them to be able to do this year.
Yeah, I agree with both of you guys, and I think that's why I reread this question. I even saw it coming on Twitter, and I reread it like 5 times, and I still kind of like when I read it, I'm like, that's how I kind of took the injury part of the question. I'm like, cool, he's always healthy, so it can't be like an injury scare here, but um, that does make a lot of sense. And again, we'll talk about maybe that composition pick and how that kind of comes into play there, but that was kind of my other aspect of that conversation as well. So then our next question here, Dan Knutson said, and this is almost as if he knew Spencer was just dying to hear this type of a question, and probably Jack too. He said, first, we'll kind of specifically talk about Corbin Burnes again here. He said your preferred game plan for Burnes, and he's talking about that pitch mix, that location, instead of just him kind of spamming people with those cutters. So let's get both of you guys' takes. What are you kind of looking for with Burnes in a perfect world, even though we know that he's not going to listen to either one of you?
More sliders. I think that's the biggest one. He has a really, really good slider. I've wanted him to throw more sliders since the moment he broke into the big leagues. He's always had a really good one, and now he arguably has an even better one because during the middle of the season, he pretty much switched from a traditional harder gyro slider to a sweeper almost on the fly to separate it from his cutter more. And even after that, he still didn't use it a whole lot. He was a little bit more willing to use it in 2-strike counts, but even then he didn't use it a whole lot to put guys away. So I think it's really just mix the breaking balls in more. So more sliders when you're throwing to righties, more curveballs when you're pitching to lefties. That was something he actually did do a better job of down the stretch, mixing more breaking balls in against lefties, and that ended up giving him reverse splits on the year. Righties actually hit him decently. Lefties couldn't do just about anything with him, and a lot of it came down to he was actually throwing more breaking stuff to lefties than he was to righties. So I think really just getting that slider usage up more is going to be a big one. I know he's had that sinker in his arsenal as well, and I've had some people argue that he should work that in more. I don't actually think he should do that because his sinker is terrible. It has high spin. It doesn't move a whole lot. Those are really bad qualities for a sinker. You want a sinker to have a low spin rate because that's going to cause gravity to make the ball drop more and create that sinking action. So Burnes just doesn't naturally throw a good sinker. So I would just say against righties, throw a lot more sliders than you have so far.
Yep. I was going to say sub out some of your cutter usage for slider usage against righties, especially. I think he could use the curveball more against righties as well. I know he started using it a lot more against lefties, and it was very effective against them. I think the slider's the better pitch against righties for him, but I don't think the usage didn't really change with the curveball against righties last year like it did against lefties. I wouldn't hate seeing that increase too, but I think that's what you're saying. Just more breaking balls, more of the off speed, kind of diversify the pitch mix more. And I agree with you. And we've talked about this a ton. So we're obviously going to have very similar thoughts because we have discussed it all the time. But yeah, that's the sinker's just not good. And he seems to trust it more than a lot of the other stuff he throws in terms of his secondaries. And I don't get why, because it's really not a very good pitch. And once in a while, he'll sneak it up on somebody and like break a bat. And I think he feels good about that sometimes and feels like it's working really well. And I think that's just a matter of when you maybe mix it in super rarely, people aren't used to it because of the cutter going the other way, but it's not a good pitch shape. It's not he doesn't locate it super well. It's just, I would be fine if they just said no more sinkers. You are straight up only a cutter guy for your fastball. And then I also do think with the way his cutter works, and he started doing this more too, but he started using more parts of the zone last year with the cutter. It wasn't just let's go down and away to righties or is down and away to lefties and righties. He was always trying to backdoor it against lefties. I would like to see him continue you don't want cutters up in the zone all the time, and it definitely depends on the shape of the cutter too, but I think he can use it as a way to get in on the hands of lefties, especially with it going up and in sometimes. And with the velocity he throws it at, he can sneak it by righties up there too when they're just constantly looking for it to be down. I would just like to see him kind of move it around up and down a little bit more. But yeah, he's done so well. He did so well with his very specific cutter usage and all this stuff. And I think it's just been very hard for him to admit that hitters adjusted and they are now sitting on that pitch and they are ready for it. and you're also not commanding it at the same level that you were during that Cy Young year where he was putting it on that, he was dotting that edge all the time. Like he was rarely making mistakes with that pitch at that point. And he's making more mistakes now. And that's not surprising because it was incredible how well he was commanding it at that point. But really, I think the main thing is just being more diverse with everything that he's throwing. Use it all a little bit more. Take that out of the cutter usage, and then use the cutter in, different locations around the zone. Don't just keep hammering side to side at the bottom of the zone because if hitters only have to worry about the bottom third of the zone, it's quite a bit easier for them to cover that area.
And then along those lines, Dan also asked, um, anyone else's pitch mix you'd like to tweak? So is there anybody else on the pitching staff where you guys are maybe frustrated by their approach? Um, Not so much in a frustrating fashion as Corbin Burns, but it could be as little as you want. Do you guys have anybody that you're specifically kind of hoping to tweak a little bit?
Yoel Payamps needs to throw more four-seamers to righties. I've been on this train for a while, and Spencer knows it too. His four-seamer is his best fastball, not his sinker. And the Brewers seem to have really gone all in on this approach of we want as many of our pitchers as possible to throw both a four-seamer and a two-seamer or a sinker, whatever you call it. They're very similar pitches, so they usually, fall under the same label. And they pretty much tell all these guys you're going to throw mostly sinkers or two-seamers to righties and mostly four-seamers to left-handed batters. And that's what Payamps did last year. But his four-seamer is just so much better than his sinker. He generates a really high spin on both of his fastballs, which, again, like we talked about, that's really good for a four-seamer because that helps give it more riding action at the top of the zone. It's bad for a sinker because it basically prevents that ball from sinking as much as it could. So between the shape concerns and also the fact that Payamps has a lower release slot, he slings the ball from a lower slot, which gives him a very flat vertical approach angle, which means that if he's throwing that fastball, it looks really, really flat to the hitter when he's throwing it up in the zone, which also contributes to getting guys to swing under that ball. So just with the velocity and the spin and the shape and the angles, it's just a much better pitch than his sinker. And that's borne out in the results too. His sinker was not an especially effective pitch last year for as much as he used it. He basically got most of his outs with his slider and his four-seamer, but he didn't use the four-seamer a whole lot to right-handed batters. And he also gets a lot more whiffs with that four-seamer too. Like, it is a legitimately good pitch. It's a good fastball. So, and if he's going to be able to sustain that uptick in strikeouts he had this year, he is going to need to, or the uptick in strikeouts he had last year, he is going to need to get a little bit more swing and miss this year. And just throwing that four-seamer more is the way to do it.
Yep. You, of course, stole the one name I had for this one. Basically, just because I had to mention that I can't complain about Adrian Hauser's pitch mix anymore, and it's a similar problem kind of with the usage of the fastballs. Now, Hauser had a much better sinker than Payamps has, and a worse four seam than Payamps has. But that was always the issue we kind of had with Hauser, was that they had gone from being somewhat equal with the four seam and the two seam usage to going so heavily towards that sinker, two seam, whatever you want to call it. I think at this point, MLB just calls them a two seam, and I don't think they even classify them as sinkers anymore, or the opposite. It's one of them, but they don't split them up.
They're all sinkers. Yeah.
Yeah. And you're right on Payamps. That's the big thing. It's the better pitch. It's the pitch he can get more strikeouts with and whiffs with. And I think he doesn't have to scrap the sinker, but it is definitely where lessening the usage, especially against righties, like we talked about. He mostly was, and you talked about how the Brewers, it's kind of a organizational philosophy to go four seam against opposite hand and sinker against same hand hitters. I would, in general, with all of the Brewers pitchers, it makes more sense to me to still use the good four seamers against the same sided batters. Like, I don't get the point of, if it's a good pitch, it's a good pitch. It doesn't need to be a platoon happy like pitch mix. I don't get why they view it that way, but I will also always add that they are smarter than me. So there's probably a reason, or they could probably explain it to me if they had to, but I always wonder about why they seem to always go that direction.
Yeah, these are the kind of questions that I would really like to hear, just asked to some people who are on the Brewers coaching staff, because there's obviously a reason for doing it. And, as much as we might like to pat ourselves on the back and claim that we know everything about pitch design, there's obviously a reason why they're doing this, but just from our vantage point, like it does not look like it's the most effective way to go about it. And I would argue that even just, on a results level, pitch by pitch, it's not even showing up in those results either. Like again, Payamps' sinker got hit pretty hard.
Yeah.
Like he was succeeding a lot, I think, in spite of his sinker. And again, there's always more to it than strict results on a pitch because no pitch exists in a vacuum. It exists within the context of the rest of the arsenal. But I mean, I'm just not convinced that sinker slider, even as a unit, as a combo, is better for Payamps against righties than four-seam sliders. So yeah, it's definitely something I'd like to see changed.
Dan also asked in time frame of Jefferson Caro debut, and if in 2024, how do we navigate his at-bats with William Contreras? This is a little extra tidbit here he threw in. Assuming Caro has 105 weighted runs created plus or higher, who gets the bulk of the catching duties in 2025?
Yeah. It's going to depend on how some of these guys they signed over the last couple months perform, I think, in terms of Caro's timeline. If Eric Haase and Austin Nola just are awful and they're unplayable, and given they're both not the best defenders and the bat is a concern, that's very much on the table for that happening, then I could see him being up pretty quickly. I could see it being like the Super 2 deadline or something around that time. I could see them bringing him up at that point. I think they'd be able to navigate the at-bat situation. It won't be easy. And adding a guy like Hoskins and kind of adding all of these, we talked about the DH options that they're going to have. In my mind, before this happened, I was thinking, well, an easy way to get Caro up and to keep him in getting time behind the plate and keeping him active so it's not a prospect just sitting there backing up Contreras and not doing anything is to have Contreras DH a decent amount. I'm not sure that'll be as easy right now, though I could see a situation where against lefties, you have Hoskins at first and Contreras DHing, and if Caro's up, then he's catching. Like I could see that type of situation, but it's also always hard to not have a bench or a catcher on the bench. It doesn't put you in the best position in terms of being able to sub, or if an injury happens, you have to mess with stuff. But that's how I was always kind of looking at it. I think it becomes a little bit harder now. And then in terms of next year, if Caro is that type of hitter, then I think that's what's going to happen is you're going to see him and Contreras kind of spending some time alternating between some DHing, some catching, keeping both of them off their feet so they're not having to handle a huge load. But if you take a look at like what the Braves did with Travis d'Arnaud this year and Sean Murphy, that type of split where I think you'd probably want to get Caro in a little bit more than d'Arnaud got because you are trying to kind of build him up for the future as well, whereas d'Arnaud's a veteran who doesn't need to get experience. I could see that type of split working where you get them pretty consistent at bats. They both get to catch a decent amount. I think you have a fantastic defensive duo in those two. In fact, I would probably say I would expect Caro to be the better of the two defenders, and that's not even close to a knock on Contreras, who made incredible strides. And I just think the arm might separate the two because Caro does have a very, very good arm, and I think they'll both be really good receivers. So it's going to be interesting. It'll be very interesting. And you can't ever, I don't want them to trade either of them in the next year or two. But if somebody came with a huge package and you feel Contreras is controlled through 2027. And if Caro comes up this year, he'll only be another couple years beyond that of control. So if somebody came with a crazy trade package for one of them, I wouldn't be shocked if they moved him. But I think we have to see what Caro does at AAA, see if he's even ready for the majors this year. If you get the same kind of production you were getting at AA and AAA, then I think he probably sees the majors at least by the end of the year. And if the two that we brought in struggle, like I would not be surprised to see them do, then that Super 2 deadline is probably what I'd be looking at for a potential call-up.
Yeah, Spencer, you kind of took the answer that I was going to give towards the end there when you talk about the Braves. That's just the first place that my mind always goes when you think about how you're going to handle the playing time situation between these two. The Braves did a very good job of having both Sean Murphy and Travis d'Arnaud and mixing playing time. And like you said, it would probably be a little bit closer to a 50-50, split rotation, whatever you want to call it, with how you divvy up playing time between those two. But I do think we're going to see Cairo probably by June. That would be my guess, because I just don't believe in Eric Haase at all. I don't think that he's going to do much of anything. I know there's been some power there in the past, but just not great plate discipline. The underlying metrics have never been good. I think they can improve the defense just, based on the last couple of guys who they've gotten to do complete 180s on defense behind the plate, but I just don't think he's going to hit. I think the Brewers are really just kind of looking for a couple of guys they could bring in to just be that holdover until K-Row's ready. And I think that is going to be by mid-season this year. So I think we're going to see quite a bit of him, and hopefully he does really well right out of the gates. But again, it is going to come down to how well he does at AAA. He just doesn't have a whole lot of experience in the minor leagues yet. He shot up through the system almost as quickly as Jackson Chourio is, which I don't think that gets talked about enough, about how K-Row's only a year older than Jackson Chourio, and he was doing a lot of the same things that Jackson Chourio was doing at the plate for much of the year, while also being one of the best defensive catchers in the minor leagues. So if you're the Brewers, you got to be really excited about that. And like you said, I don't think there needs to be any motivation to trade one of those guys, because there is a pretty good likelihood now that you are going to have the best catching tandem in baseball, and that is extremely valuable. So if you're the Brewers, you should be, licking your lips at the thought of being able to have that long term, and you should be really excited about that. And I think we're going to see that tandem surface this year already in the second half.
And then Dan's last question here brings us no joy to read, but I will read it. He says, how many at-bats will Keston get in the MLB in 2024? And your best guess with who? And why is it the Colorado Rockies?
Keston Hiura will not get a single MLB at-bat this year. He's going to be playing in Asia.
Okay, I like that prediction, because I was thinking about that. I was also thinking about the Rockies, Gunner. That was probably going to be, if he is on an MLB team, I could see them trying to replicate Nolan Jones without any defense. A guy who kind of had strikeout issues, was a pretty big prospect, had shown some flashes at times, but might hit a little better when the spin doesn't quite work the same way in that thin air. And
the Rockies aren't thinking about that, though. They're not going that deep into it. This is the Rockies we're talking about.
Well, that's true. But yeah, I would say they're probably the team that I keep coming back to. Like, I could see them not only giving him a chance, but then giving him quite a few at-bats to try and figure it out. But if not, I was thinking the same thing. I think overseas is a pretty decent possibility. I'm not sure he's going to be willing to sign a minor league deal in the States again. And I don't blame him. I think we've seen a lot of guys go over there now and then be able to come back to MLB later on. I think that's almost as better chance than going to AAA and doing the same thing that he's been doing, which is hitting really well at that level.
I mean, if you think about it too, and this just kind of popped into my head, like if the problem for him is hitting spin, going overseas is probably the better option for him if he's going to get better at that. Like, the guys overseas really hammer you with breaking balls versus, when you're playing in AAA, and this is, if you talk to player development people, they'll tell you that AAA a lot of times is really not a great place for hitters to be as far as developing, because that's where, a lot of these 4A pitchers are, these guys who don't have super exciting stuff. They're not going to spin the ball a whole lot. Their metrics on their pitches aren't great, and they're just kind of there as big league depth. And when Keston Hiura is facing those kinds of guys, he crushes them. But as soon as he gets to the big leagues and he sees MLB quality stuff and MLB quality spin, he can't do anything with it. And, he'll maybe run into some home runs and hit for power, but I don't think the rate at which he was doing that in his last big league season was sustainable. So I do think that going overseas and seeing all that spin and being exposed to that kind of playing environment, if he is going to improve in that regard, that might actually be the place to do it.
No, that's a really good point.
Yeah, I would just fear him on the Rockies, because I know how Brewers Twitter would do if he does have a hot streak and hit some home runs, and then I have to hear about all of that. So that is why I feared that. So the next question we got from Johnny C. He asks, Wes Clark is a prospect that some have talked about, but seems to be getting a bit more attention with the good AFL and AA numbers in 2023. What's your ceiling and floor for Wes, and do you think the crew views him as a future first base or DH?
Yeah, funny enough, we got this question before the Rhys Hoskins deal happened, and I thought about it, and my ceiling came to Rhys Hoskins. That was kind of like the best case scenario with him, was a guy like Hoskins, someone who hits for a lot of power, and there's definitely some strikeout, but he's willing to take walks. Probably not the best defender, but capable of playing first base. Um, there were a ton of comparisons. I was looking at it. They're both kind of smaller school guys until Wes Clark ended up transferring to South Carolina, and that's where he got drafted out of. But he he reminded me of Hoskins. Now, I will say Clark actually played like 30 some games of catcher this last year. Some people seem to think that that means he might be able to do it. I don't see any chance he can do it at at the major league level. He'd probably be your emergency catcher if he's on the roster, where if something terrible happens and you have to put a catcher in, that's your guy. But he's a first base DH for sure. Probably preferably a DH even. But I think he'd be able to handle first base as well as most of the guys that the Brewers have been throwing over at first base the last few years, which include Rowdy and Vogelbach and all these guys who they can't move much. He's not a very good athlete.
You mean Rowdy Tellez is not an excellent defensive first baseman, like I've been told?
Yeah, Bill might have been lying to us on that one.
Rowdy's got like really good hands. I'll give him that.
He
Like
does.
he can pick it really well. I always describe him as like a brick wall. Anything that hits a brick wall, the brick wall will stop it. It's not
Yep.
getting past the brick wall, but the brick wall also can't move.
Yep.
Like if it is not hit to the brick wall and it doesn't touch the brick wall is not going to go get the ball.
Yep. And actually, I would say Clark, being a catcher, he has very good hands too. That's kind of the one thing that he does have defensively. So floor wise for him, it's a quad A hitter who just strikes out too much and doesn't maybe tap into the power as much as you would hope against upper level pitching. And honestly, the floor is kind of like the worst version of Keston, is just a guy who doesn't have a position, can definitely run into one, but is going to strike out a lot and just isn't really a major league player. So that's where I landed on ceiling and floor. But I like Wes Clark, and I think he's probably one that people have been overlooking a bit as somebody who, before Hoskins, I thought might actually impact this year's team at some point. I think it's probably less likely now.
And our next question is from Emanin. That's his no name backwards. He asks, "What is the general hit rate of prospects with an elite hit tool or elite tool versus jack of all type players? Is there a difference by position?" He put in quotes, "Corners needing to hit for in power and pitchers needing more than just a fastball. Do you see any market inefficiencies? How does it affect your prospect evaluations?"
I think for the most part, you're going to want the jack of all trade type of players. The more that you can do average or better is going to help you quite a bit at the MLB level. If you can have average tools across the board and then an elite tool, that's probably the type of guy you would be looking for. But if you're going to be a guy who, I'll use some Brewer examples here, speed is like your thing. That is all you have in like an Astori Ruiz. He's not even that good of a defender. I wouldn't even say he's a bad defender on top of all of the stuff he lacks offensively, but the speed that he carries really brought him up through the system. And he did start tapping into some minor league power and stuff, but speed was what was carrying him this entire time. And we saw at the major league level, you have to have more than that. And then look at it from the defensive side. That's Bryce Terang. Like, yeah, he could be a utility player because the defense is that good. And he's a good base runner and all of that. But if you can't hit it all, the defense isn't going to be enough to make you a legitimate player. And when you're looking at prospects, you are looking for guys who are going to, help with the depth. But for the most part, when you're looking at prospects, you're trying to find guys who are going to be impact players. And I don't think you're going to be an impact player unless you can sacrifice speed, for a bigger guy, a first baseman, a third baseman, a catcher. You don't need to have every tool be average or better. But for the most part, you're going to want, if you have a slightly worse hit tool, you got to have big power. If you have a really good hit tool, you got to at least have a little bit of pop. Very rarely are those outliers going to be good. I think you need to be good at you need to be serviceable at almost everything. And then you have the elite tool or two on top of it. Those are the guys you're looking for. And I would say the hit rate on those types of people are going to be much, much, much higher than the people who have just huge power or even just a really good hit tool, but they can't play defense, or really good defense, but you don't have a hit tool or power. Like, those guys are not going to hit very often in terms of being a serviceable MLB player. Um,
This is not even really his question, by the way, but I've always, growing up, like playing baseball, I've always wondered, like, the third baseman needs to hit home runs, the first baseman needs to hit home runs, and like, I always thought that was kind of a stupid concept of like, why can't like the third baseman kind of be like a quote unquote like shortstop where he doesn't hit a bunch of home runs, but your shortstop hits a lot of home runs. Like, I just always kind of thought it was a little bit of a dumber concept growing up, but I know that's not even his question. That was what popped into my head when I
no,
don't think
that's a
it
good
is,
point.
yeah,
I think it's more how the team is
right.
designed is what matters in the end more than
Mhm.
having very specific prototypes for each position. I don't think that matters. I think the Brewers have been showing that with Willie Adames at shortstop and then some of the guys playing third base being 10 homer guys like Andrew
Mhm.
Monasterio and players like that. But you have Willie in the middle at a position that's not normally seen as a stereotypical power position. He's hitting 25 to 30 homers, so you kind of make up for it on that side of things. But it's a good question. It's really hard to, I could probably talk about it for a really long time, but I'm not going to. We are already going pretty long here. Um, but I do think it obviously matters too by position in terms of, I think more looking at it from like a pitcher's perspective. I think that pitchers can get by with fewer like good traits across the board if they have elite ones than position players can. I just think you can't have 20 grade command and no breaking ball, even if the fastball is 105. Like it doesn't matter at that point. But if you have bad command, an okay breaking ball, and an 80 fastball, that can be an MLB reliever that can help a team. Um, that's pretty hard to do from a position player standpoint. So I think it matters how you look at it from that perspective in terms of the position. But like you were saying, positionally, I don't care that much where each person plays in terms of how it matches up with their tools. I care a lot more about how they're going to fit into the roster that they would be joining. And if in the end you're getting everything you need from these types of players, which the Brewers did lack power the last year, especially. So you probably weren't getting enough power from positions that you would normally hope for some from, like first base, where we got Rowdy hit one homer in a span of like 3 months. Um, but in the end, I think it's more about team construction than it is about certain players needing certain tools at certain positions.
Mhm. Then our next question is from Spencer Johnson, the better Spencer. He says, "What are the odds both Frelick and Mitchell are stay on the team, and how do they split playing time if they're both on the team? This feels like a higher stakes Urias versus Arcia in 2020 and 2021, and then there's also Jackson Churio in the wings now as well. So how do they split up playing time if we kind of do think they're going to stand pat here?"
I mean, it kind of goes back to what we talked about before. Like, there's nothing stopping the Brewers from optioning one of those guys to AAA if there's not a whole lot of playing time for them, or if, one of them doesn't hit as well as they're hoping. So I don't think that's a huge concern. In terms of if they are both on the roster, I don't know. The more I think about it, I have a harder time seeing both of them on the roster because they're both left-handed bats. So it's not a situation where you can really divvy up one position between the two of them. Maybe you get to a spot where one of them is getting more playing time at the expense of like a Weimer or a Churio, but I don't think it's going to be a situation where they're both on the roster at the same time and in direct competition for one spot. So I wouldn't be surprised if Mitchell possibly gets optioned if they feel that they're covered with left-handed bats and Frelick is the one who's doing better, or even vice versa. Like I said, Frelick is the one who I feel a lot better about producing at the plate. Mitchell is the one who also has the much higher ceiling offensively, though. So we'll see what happens. But again, there's just not a whole lot of stakes here, I would argue. Part of the question says it feels like higher stakes than Urias and Arcia, but I don't think there are stakes here because, again, you have that flexibility. Neither one of these guys has a whole lot of MLB experience versus, when you were talking about Urias versus Arcia, Urias had a couple of years of experience under his belt. Arcia had been one of the longest tenured Brewers on that roster when they decided to move on from him. And so that was a very large sample of him just not producing whatsoever at the plate. So I don't think that's an entirely fair comparison there. I think it is a different situation. So I think the way it plays out is going to be a little bit different. I don't see it being a situation where one stays in the organization and the other leaves. I think it's more likely we see a situation where one is on the roster and the other's in AAA.
Yeah, I going into you speaking there, I was thinking that I hadn't thought about it as much as you were just laying out, but it would be hard for them to both be on the roster, especially I'm assuming Churio's going to be starting the year in the majors and playing every day. If he's up, he's playing every day. Um, I think a guy like Weimer is probably someone who you'd feel a little better about being in a platoon split with one of Frelick or Mitchell, but all three of them kind of splitting time at one spot almost just doesn't feel possible or likely or smart. Um, and then you have a guy like Blake Perkins who can be that guy where you don't care if he's playing every day, but he's helpful when he gets in the game. He seems more likely to probably hold down that last outfield spot in that scenario. So, yeah, I would agree with everything Jack said there. And then just quickly, I'll touch on this question we got from Josh. He just asked, will we see Sal Frelick play second base at all? I get the question because he did play it a little bit in college, and some people thought he might be kind of a all over the field utility player when he got drafted. He has not played an inning of infield since being drafted. Unless they're being very secretive and he's suddenly been training as an infielder this offseason, I would say it's very, very unlikely we see him playing any infield. It'd be fun if he could handle it defensively. It would actually potentially help solve a lot of those issues. But I would assume the fact that he hasn't played there at all means he can't handle it defensively.
Yeah, don't quote me on this, but I feel like I remember hearing from someone somewhere that the second base thing in college did not go very well for him.
Yeah, that makes sense.
CL the GOAT asked, what is one prospect that seems like a long shot right now, but you think will be in Milwaukee at some point this season?
Yeah, I had a few names that I kind of came up with. The tough part with this is I'm not sure I would say any of these guys will be in Milwaukee this year as long shots, but they're guys that I could see being in Milwaukee. I mostly was looking at it, and it's usually relievers that people don't know about that end up kind of forcing their way into the majors and people weren't looking for it. Shane Smith is a name that I really like. He made his way up to Double A. He started in Carolina this year, and then he got all the way up to Double A. Also pitched a couple innings in the Arizona Fall League, but he's an interesting arm that I think could be a potential bullpen option once we get deeper into the season and you have maybe some injuries or some guys who don't perform and you start diving a little deeper into the arms that are available to you. I also think Tobias Myers is a name, and Jack and I talked about this a little bit on Twitter. He's only 25. It feels like I've known that name for a long time because he got traded for Junior Caminero at one point, and he was a big prospect name at one point, and then he kind of fell off. The Brewers signed him to a minor league deal, but he's got pretty elite fastball characteristics, and the velo took a pretty big jump when he got into the bullpen. It actually made a big jump in general this year too. Baseball America put it out. He was among like the top 20 velocity jumps in baseball. He went from 89 as his average velocity, and then he started most of the year this year. So this is based mostly on his starting velocity, but he got up to 93 almost on average this year. So it was a big jump all around. And then we saw it get up into the mid 90s and even touching 98 in AAA when he went out of the bullpen. So I think the idea that he could play up quite a bit out of the pen makes him an interesting possibility. And then I guess if I had to give a out of left field somewhat option on the hitting side, it's Eric Brown Jr., which I don't expect it, but I think there's a really good chance he's going to have that he's taking almost a Tyler Black type of route where people didn't even think Black had a shot at the majors going into last season. He was coming off injury, which Eric Brown had issues with injury. He hadn't really shown power. Eric Brown struggled with showing power, but they both went to the Arizona Fall League and started showing signs of figuring some things out. I think, would be a very, very good defensive second baseman. I think he could play shortstop as well. If he's having a really good start to the year in Double A, which he's going to start there, and they move him to Triple A somewhat quickly, and we see all of these names that we've talked about in Terang and Oliver Dunn and Christian Arroyo and all these guys, and they're just not doing enough, and he keeps performing like I think he might. He's probably the one position guy that I think would be a pretty big surprise to people going into the season that I could potentially see making an impact.
Just to say shameless self-plug here, I did write an article on Tobias Myers the week before we're recording this, so it's out there. My thoughts are out there.
Go read that.
Yes, go read everything Jack writes because all of it's good. Um, I guess one
Most of
name
it's
I
good.
didn't say, but I actually wrote an article about him. Patrick Dorian. He's not really a prospect. I think he's 27 right now, but really, really interesting bat. I think Gunnar, at one point I talked to you about him last year that I thought he was pretty interesting. Left-handed bat who had major platoon splits. Like he can't face lefties at all, but he kind of crushed righties. The batted ball data backs it up really well. I mean, he smoked the ball against righties. He was in like the 97th percentile for average exit velocity. He had, I think it was the third most batted balls over 95 miles per hour in AAA last year. He hits the ball at a pretty ideal launch angle, and his average fly ball distance was the longest in all of AAA. I think he's a guy who could tap into some pretty legitimate power at the major league level. He strikes out a ton. His walks went down a little bit last year, but he's also a guy who handles third base, shortstop, second, and first base. He spent time at all of them. Second or shortstop's probably pushing it at the major league level, but I think he could be a pretty solid third base and second baseman. So he's a name that I think isn't a prospect necessarily, but he was a guy they acquired in a trade for cash from the Orioles a couple of years ago. And I think he's pretty interesting bat that I could see maybe being like the not the same type of hitter, but the Andrew Monasterio of this year, where everyone's like, "Oh, who is this?" And he kind of helps out the team. So that's one name I forgot to put out there, but there is an article about him on Brewer Fanatic that I broke down all those numbers I just talked about a little bit more. Yeah, those are the names that pop into my head.
I do not write articles, by the way, so don't look for my articles online anywhere. But go read Spencer and Jack's articles. I think Jack missed it, but we did have Spencer had a big rant about people not reading articles in our Bucks episode last time.
I
So
did.
that's actually perfect timing. So a good plug. Our next question from Tyler Labs, but I'm not going to try to pronounce his last name. That's Labs with two A's. He says, "Who do you view as our third baseman of the future, and why is it Luke Adams?" You guys know my answer to this. Maybe it's your answer as well, but who do you guys think?
Yeah, I would agree with your answer that you didn't give, but I know what it is. I think it's between, for me, Tyler Black and Brock Wilken at the moment. I was surprised at both of their abilities to play third base last year. Black had not looked very good before last season, and I thought he made some very, very real strides, and I actually think he can handle it. Wilken, it's hard to find too much video on guys playing defense in college, but the reports weren't very good. And I wouldn't say he's a good defender at third base, but he has probably the best arm of any infielder in the system. I mean, it's probably a 70 or 80 grade arm. It's a cannon from third base. And he moved better laterally than I expected him to. And he came in on the ball pretty well. I saw him make some throws on the run. He's a big dude. I don't know how long he'd be able to handle third base because of the size, and it might not age super well there. But I saw Miguel Cabrera play third base for a decently long time, and that's kind of what it reminds me of. Who obviously he eventually moved to first, except for the 1 year where they randomly put him back at third because they had Prince Fielder. But that's kind of who he reminds me of defensively, where it's like, yeah, if he hits like I think he could hit, then the defense he plays there will hold up just fine. So those are my two. But I will say, and people who have listened before, I love Luke Adams. He's like the infield version of Joey Weimer, just an absolute. He is so fun to watch. It is out of control, but he hits the ball so hard, and he actually walks a ton. He doesn't swing out of the zone much. So I like Luke Adams a lot. And if down the road he is the third baseman, it would not be a shock at all.
Yeah, I think I would take Wilken over Tyler Black. Black's obviously going to get a shot at playing time at third base first, simply because he's going to debut this year. Wilken, maybe we see him in the second half this year if he continues to rise that quickly through the minor leagues. But my thing with Black is, as much as I like his chances of, carving out a nice productive MLB career, at the same time, the lack of home run power makes me wonder if he instead just ends up as more of this, he's a really solid player, but, maybe the Brewers end up trading him a couple years into his tenure with the team if they think that he can be, part of a package that brings him back, more long-term talents, maybe some higher ceiling players, not that he's going to be a bad player, but, if he spends a couple of years in Milwaukee as, whether it's at third base or first base, and he's, a nice, solid, productive, 2.5, 3-win player, something along those lines, but say there's a good deal out there for him, Brewers trade him. Brock Wilken is now the guy long term. Like I could definitely see something like that playing out just because Wilken's got a higher ceiling with the powers. So that's something that I really think matters if you're going to talk to about not just who's going to get here first, but also long term, who's more likely to end up spending more time at that position and who has a better chance of really carving out a name as, okay, this is a guy who held down third base for a really long time in Milwaukee and had some really great seasons versus, oh, this is a solid player who spent a couple of years here, but he didn't really make a lasting impact on the franchise. I think Wilken is more likely to fall into that former category, and Black is a little bit more likely to fall into that latter category.
Yeah, I think that's all fair. I have said before, I actually do think Tyler Black's best defensive position is in the outfield. And it wouldn't shock me if you saw if I if he ended up being kind of a I don't even know honestly how well or how good of a defender Ben Zobrist was. I don't remember that. But I could see him kind of filling that type of role where he plays almost every day, but it's some left field, some third base, some second base, some first base and shortstop never, obviously, but I think he could handle all three outfield spots. Right, might be pushing it with the arm. I thought he's a really good center fielder when he played out there. Honestly, I thought he looked very good out there. But in terms of the organizational depth right now, it makes a lot more sense for him to be an infielder at the moment. Um, but say some of those guys aren't hitting that we've talked about so many times, and he is hitting, but it's hard to find a defensive spot. I would not be surprised to see him kind of shuttled back out to the outfield at some point, and maybe the Ryan Braun type of role where he's a third baseman for a year, and then all of a sudden we're looking at him in left field in the future. So I did want to throw that out there because I do think that's a pretty decent possibility for him too.
Yeah, I mean, what made me excited about Tyler Black, as Jack mentioned, was that power jump up this last year because he didn't really have it before that. So that was kind of like the last Infinity Stone to his gauntlet was like, yeah, now I got the power now. So kind of completed him a little bit. Um,
I would note too, we did see a little bit more just in terms of the home run power, but his overall like quality of contact metrics in AAA were still not amazing. So
Yeah.
there is a part of me that
mhm.
wonders, is that power jump actually for real? Is that going to be something that he sustains, especially when he gets to the big leagues? Maybe, maybe not. I think no matter what, he's going to be more of a doubles guy, but it is going to be interesting to see how that power plays out because that's really going to have a big impact on how he
Yeah.
fits into this roster, what kind of career he's able to carve out for himself, what positions he profiles best at, just all kinds of different things like that. The plate discipline gives him a nice high floor. He should be able to be a productive bat. It's just a question now really of how high that ceiling is.
Yeah, and I will say on the overall batted ball data in AAA, if you were to have taken the first like 3 weeks that he was down there and looked at it just at that point, it was horrific. He got off to a really, really bad start in terms of hitting the ball. I mean, it was choppers, it was broken bats. It took him some time to adjust. And then I think if you could take and pull out the time beyond that, then it starts looking a lot better because it ended up, like you said, it looked okay by the end. And given how it started, he did look much, much better and more comfortable. And I think the batted ball data would look a lot better if you just scrapped the first like 3 weeks of adjusting to that level. But it is still, I don't think the home run power of 20 like he hit is going to be a legitimate major league output for him at any point. I think he's probably more of in a good year, maybe you get 20, but probably more of a 10 to 15 guy with a bunch of doubles, like you were saying. So,
yeah, 10 to 12 is kind of the range I would put him at. Even 15 feels like maybe a little bit of a stretch for me, but yeah, you're talking like, maybe moderate home run power at best, but a lot of line drives in the gaps, and that's really where the production's going to be coming from.
Yep. So our next, after you guys just try to make me sad about Tyler Black, we'll be moving on to the next question of
Not sad about Tyler Black, just measured. Like I try to, if anyone's been following me for a little bit, I think they know that I usually try to stay pretty measured when it comes to prospect expectations. So,
Oh yeah. No, you're all correct in everything you said. I don't disagree with one thing. But someone actually did have a funny tweet. I just thought of this right now today. It came up on my For You page. And it's funny because it's just a conversation. It wasn't meant to be a funny tweet, but it said they're kind of betting that Tyler Black will have a better rookie season than Jackson Churio. I guess I could see that happening. It's just kind of a funny discussion to have, but I would assume that Jackson's going to have a much better career than Tyler Black.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could.
No.
Churio is whatever. He's younger and a little bit rawer than Black, so I could definitely see that
Mhm.
playing out that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I saw somebody say, and this made a lot of sense. Somebody kind of comped Churio to Bobby Witt and was like, I could see a slow start where you see the flashes quite a bit. And even defensively, he started a lot slower. Then all of a sudden, Witt went from one of the worst defensive shortstops to one of the best over the course of that like year. Um, I could see that with Churio a little bit. I think he's going to be okay this first year, but I could see Black having a better rookie season, and that would not surprise me at all.
Yeah, I'm thinking like 90 weighted runs created plus for Churio as a rookie. I think that's a pretty realistic baseline.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So then our next question was from Better Than EDK. And this question is, we kind of actually in-depthly talked about this question, funny enough, with Jack the last time he was here. But he said, what do you know about Pat Murphy? How will his philosophy change, if at all? What do you know about his NCAA track record? So I guess I could just start quick because I don't know if we're going to have a ton of talk about this one, but we're just kind of hoping it does change from his track record from his NCAA kind of tenure. Obviously, I was a respected coach back then, but we're just kind of hoping that maybe some of those character flaws that people might have pointed out has changed from his tenure then, and sort of something that maybe he picked up this last tenure at the Brewers, maybe that he can just apply it to the actual manager job now. But do you guys have any other dying thoughts on this topic? Because I know that we talked about it a lot already.
Yeah, I mean, I just wouldn't necessarily describe them as character flaws. I would just describe it more as what we know about the way that he used to manage in college. I don't know if that's entirely compatible with the vibe of this Brewers team. It's definitely much different than the way that Craig Counsell ran things. It wasn't, so much this, he's going to get in your face and be really tough on you vibe that he had in college. That works for a lot of players, and a lot of players have praised him for that after having that kind of instruction in college. It's really just going to come down to, is Murphy adaptable to the point where, he can use the right kind of communication styles that are going to resonate with this clubhouse, resonate with individual players. That's really what a big part of coaching and managing is. You're going to have to do things in different ways and do different things to reach different players. And he's been around in this clubhouse for a long time now. Part of the reason he got this job is because the players know him and they're comfortable with him. The dynamic is obviously going to be a lot different with him as a manager versus bench coach because his responsibilities have changed. But I think the hope is just really that he's going to be adaptable and that he's going to be able to make the adjustments he needs to effectively handle this clubhouse.
Yeah. No, I don't really have anything to add on that. Like we said, the track record for NCAA, he had a very, very good record in college. He was one of the best managers in college baseball. I kind of took the question as how will philosophy change from Counsell to Murphy, and Jack kind of touched on it, but I don't think it's going to be much. I think he's going to have his own flavor of how he does things, like every manager does and should. It's got to be authentic. It's got to be yourself. But I think he has learned, he acknowledged it. He's learned a ton since he came to Milwaukee about how the major league game works. When he got that Padres interim job, he literally had never been on a major league staff. He was the AAA manager when he got that opportunity. Um, so now he's learned how Major League Baseball works. He's learned a lot about how the game works, and he's seen it from the perspective of how the Brewers can do it. So I'm not too worried about it. I feel so much better than I did when I first heard the news and when I was kind of bracing for the news because I was expecting it. But we'll see how it plays out in the end. I mean, none of us really know what's going to happen. I would say I feel a lot more comfortable given what he's said since he was hired, the way he talks about things, the way players talk about him. It sounds like it could be a pretty nice fit. So I'm excited to see how it plays out.
Yeah, I was gonna say all of his interviews that he's done pretty much since he's gotten the job, I've kind of fallen in love with the guy. He seems like a really cool guy, um, and a guy you'd really want to play for. And like Jack said, I mean, the guys since he's been with the Brewers, they've all spoken really highly of him, which is a pretty good indication that hopefully things will change in that specific area. Then we're gonna have to wait and see, I guess, and how he actually manages. Um, so our last question here, to wrap up our mailbag segment, is from Logan I-54, and this is where it's kind of that we talked about it earlier with the Corbin question of the competitive balance pick. That's kind of where it comes into play. He starts it out by saying, Here's my pet theory regarding Corbin Burns trade options. Would love to hear your thoughts. Right now, Matty A values the comp balance pick, more importantly, the extra slot money than any kind of Burns return he's been offered. I think it stays this way. Is this viable?
Yeah, so like I kind of touched on earlier, I think that is absolutely weighed into the equation here. I think that comp pick, first of all, I just for people who don't really know how it works, the Brewers are a revenue sharing recipient, meaning they're in the bottom half of the payrolls, so they get some of the revenue sharing. As long as they aren't in the competitive balance tax, which we know they are absolutely not going to be. Basically, if they offer the qualifying offer to Burns, we could add this to Adames. We could even add it potentially to Rhys Hoskins if he were to opt out of his contract. So you could potentially offer 3 qualifying offers in this next offseason if all ends up going that direction. If you lose a player and he signs for at least 50 million on a qualifying offer and you're in the Brewers situation with the revenue sharing, you get a pick right behind the first round, even before the competitive balance round A, meaning it's as high of a pick as you can get that isn't an actual first round pick. If they sign for less than 50 million, then it comes after the competitive balance round B, which is after round 2. So it matters quite a bit how much they sign for, but I would assume that both Willie and Burns, if they were to get qualifying offers and decline them, would end up getting well over 50 million total. So there's a pretty good chance the Brewers would be getting basically 2 extra first round picks in that scenario. That also means you get about $2.5 million each in slot bonus money, which means you would have almost, in that scenario, you could almost see an opportunity for the Brewers to like buy down a top 5 pick all the way down to their pick because they would have so much extra slot money available. So it gives them a lot of stuff to play with. And I think that does play a lot into what they're valuing the type of return that they might get in a trade. Um, it's very hard to put like the next question he had was to ask what kind of a current prospect that would be comparable in value to the competitive balance pick that they would get from that qualifying offer. I think that's super hard to say or to give a real example. I'm sure the Brewers have like a number system that they would weigh in terms of, okay, this is what we view the potential pick as, this is what we view players as. I'm sure all of that comes into the thought process. I do think it's important to note that the prospect return would need to be better than what you get, not just from the comp pick, but from the comp pick and whatever Burns does in 2024. Because if Burns is helping the team a lot in 2024 and you're getting that comp pick, you have to factor that into what you're actually getting in the prospect return or I would guess a return they would want some major league talent too, but in the return for Burns, there's so much at play in that regard. And I do think you're right that comp pick is a big part of the equation for Arnold and for all of the negotiations he may have been having for Burns. But just to give an idea of like the type of player you can get in the range of those comp picks, just from the Brewers' perspective, Tyler Black was right in that range. Josh Noth was right in that range because they were competitive balance round A picks. Shane McClanahan was right around that time. There's been a lot of valuable players drafted around that time. So the MLB draft is a bit of a crapshoot, and the slot money is probably even the more important part, which you pointed out, Logan. It's a lot to weigh. I think you're right that it's playing a huge part in the fact that they haven't even presumably been close to a deal. I think if that wasn't on the table and it was just lose Burns at the end of the season for nothing, then I think we would have almost certainly seen him traded by now. But I think that comp pick is weighing pretty heavily. And we just saw it with this last draft, how they can use this bonus money. They spread it out so well last draft that they were able to bring in multiple high school picks that people thought were unsignable when the Brewers drafted them. And they were able to do that while signing almost every player in their draft class. If they view it that highly and they think they can continue to kind of follow that path in terms of just bringing in tons of talent by having extra slot money, that might be more valuable to them than most prospect packages that they could get in a trade. So I don't know exactly what they're thinking, but I do think you're on the right track in saying that that's playing a big role in their decision. But yeah, that's all I got on those 2 questions.
Do you just want to jump into that third question since he kind of called you out a little bit?
He did say, I know you're the draft guy, Spencer. Does this approach make sense every year? There aren't enough spots in the minors for that to work, though. So maybe next draft, it's more about going over slot on a couple bigger name guys, just food for thought and slow offseason. So I guess I could see them trying to go that route this upcoming summer in the draft. To me, I think the number of spots in the minors might be a little bit overrated right now. There's always going to be players that are hanging around that you can cut. There's going to be people who filter in and out of the majors. They have the development list. You're going to have injuries. The max that you're going to add in this draft is going to be 21 players. Like, I think they'll be able to find space for all of them if they have to. I could still see them doing what you're saying though, and going after maybe a bigger fish this year than they've gone after the last year. Instead of spreading it out, maybe they, like I said earlier, they could try and buy somebody down to their range where they really, really like a guy, or it would probably be more of a high school person or a junior in college who maybe is considering going back if he doesn't get a certain number. But I do think they could keep this approach almost every year and be just fine. I think in the Brewers situation, you want to add as much talent as possible at all times. And the more, I mean, look at what the Rays do. That's what they do. They're rarely having draft classes where they're not signing almost everybody they drafted. They're adding as much talent as they possibly can, and then they churn through it through trades. They churn through it by bringing all of them up and having them in the best situation possible for their platoon splits, or however they can use them the best. Like, that's kind of how I see the Brewers trying to go. It seems like they've tried to go that direction more lately, and I think they can continue to do it. I don't think it's an unsustainable method of them for them in the draft. I think they could keep doing it. It wouldn't be a problem. So with that, I think we got to say thank you to Jack for joining us today. And Jack, you got anything you'd like to plug? I know you kind of threw out your one article, but anything else you've been working on or putting out there that you'd like people to check out?
Yeah, I've just been trying to get in some more player breakdowns as we get a little closer to spring training. I wrote the Myers breakdown last week. The week before that, I did a breakdown on Joey Weimer's swing, some of the things that he's probably going to need to adjust with that if he's going to have a little bit more success in his sophomore season in the big leagues. Working on something about Aaron Ashby, who's coming back from shoulder surgery last year, just different things like that. Just generally at Brew Crew Ball, as we get closer to spring training, we're going to be doing a preview by position series that we do every spring. So got a couple different things in the hopper that'll be coming out over the next few weeks here.
Yep. Breaking down WLC pitcher arsenals too. So we got a lot of breakdowns from Jack coming up.
Those are
will not be
internal
public.
breakdowns. Yes. Mm-hmm.
No, but thank you again for joining us. It is you are always welcome. Like I said, you are our favorite multi-time guest so far. So congrats.
Thank you, Jack.
Yeah, I guess I'm competing with myself for that title, but thank you guys.
Yes. No, we
Thanks for being on.
Yeah,
we do
thank you for having me.
genuinely appreciate it. So thank you for coming on. And yeah, I'll see you tomorrow.
Yes, you will.
All right. So thanks again to Jack for joining us. Again, this was all pre-recorded kind of on Thursday night of last week. We just wanted to make sure that we split it up and gave everything a little bit of a chance to breathe instead of having some insane 2+ hour episode. We split it into two. So if you missed the one that we did last week, that was focused on the Rhys Hoskins move, and some of the other moves that had happened around there. So if you haven't heard that one yet, go check it out. As always, Jack does great work for Brew Crew Ball. Make sure you're following him on Twitter. Follow him. He's at by Jack Stern. And check out all of his work. And just always very thankful for him giving us some time. And then for those of you who are listening, again, please like and subscribe on whatever platform you are listening on. Remember to follow us on Twitter at the Cream City Pod. And assuming that we are still running this giveaway at the time, please make sure to enter it and give yourself a chance to win 7 autograph cards. Again, this is no charge to you at all. We will cover the shipping. So yeah, nothing hurt, just a retweet and a couple follows and you're entered. So take part in that. And then, yeah, as always, please feel free to leave us feedback on how we can get better. Thank you all for listening to both of these episodes, and we will see you next time.